In October 2007, a historic conference was held at Andrews University. It happened to be the 50th anniversary of the publishing of the book Questions on Doctrine. The purpose of the conference was to evaluate the impact of questions on doctrine on the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And invited were both Adventist and non-Adventist scholars. Now, this was more than a historical analysis, because just a few years before that, Questions on Doctrine had been reprinted with editorial notes explaining the good and bad parts of that particular book. And my friends, this book and its issues will not go away, because it's not dealing with prophetic interpretations over which we might agree or disagree, or even doctrinal statements. It is dealing with the heart and soul of a relationship with Christ, righteousness by faith, the gospel, and our understanding of it. And it is directly related to the church's reason for existence. Now, it's interesting to note that this conference did not take place with the blessing of the then General Conference President, Elder Jan Paulsen. The issue, Paulsen said, that has the potential of dividing the church most is theology. He said he does not support another restudy of theological issues originally presented 50 years ago in the book Questions on Doctrine, particularly regarding the nature of Christ. He said, I just cannot imagine a postmodern person in Europe, a businessman in Asia or Latin America, any more than a farmer in Africa will care one iota whether Christ had the nature of man before the fall. Paulsen said, the realities of the world in which we live have other concerns and other priorities which occupy us. Now, he accurately understands that what has the most potential to divide Adventism is theology, not organization, not women's ordination, or even differing worship services, because our theology determines who we are and what constitutes our reason for existence. And the reason he did not encourage this restudy is because the book began a shift in Adventist theology, which has produced a widening chasm between differing theologies in Adventism, and he was fully aware that it is virtually impossible to bring these theologies back into harmony again in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he would rather let sleeping dogs lie to preserve the illusion of unity. Now, he was absolutely right that people in Europe or Africa won't care one iota about the nature of Christ, but neither will they care one iota about which day to go to church or whether there's a sanctuary in heaven. Because people don't understand issues does not mean that those issues are not important. They may be hugely significant for future developments on planet Earth. I thought this was a very, very short-sighted and careless statement from a world leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, a little background to this conference. Late in 2003, Questions on Doctrine was republished by the Andrews University Press with historical notes and a theological introduction by George Knight. Published in 1957 originally, this book, Knight said in his introduction, easily qualifies as the most divisive book in Seventh-day Adventist history. Amen. It all began when T.E. Unruh, who was then president of the East Pennsylvania Conference, wrote a letter to Donald Barnhouse, wherein he complimented Barnhouse's radio program on righteousness by faith. And this letter led eventually to another young man, Walter Martin, a specialist in Christian cults, to visit Washington in March 1955 and hear directly from Adventist leaders what they believed regarding certain doctrines that Martin said were cultic. The four issues that Walter Martin was concerned about, he understood Seventh-day Adventists to teach, number one, that the atonement of Christ was not completed at the cross. Number two, that salvation is the result of grace plus works, the works of the law. Number three, that the Lord Jesus was a created being. not existing from all eternity. And number 4, that Christ partook of man's sinful fallen nature when he came down to this earth. Walter Martin came in one day to the discussions with a suitcase, literally a suitcase full of books, publications from Adventist publishing houses, and said, "Do you know that your denomination teaches these things?" He stated that less than 20% of the Adventist books in print at that time were acceptable. Unfortunately, M.L. Andreasen, the denomination's most influential theologian and theological writer in the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s, had been left out of the process of both the formulation of the answers and the critiquing of them. And George Knight said something very, very interesting. He said, "Looking back, one can only speculate on the different course of Adventist history if Andreasen had been consulted regarding the wording of the Adventist position on the atonement." The different course of Adventist history? The next event was a crescendo of ministry editorials and articles that joined with a remarkably orchestrated PR program in workers' meetings throughout North America. It appeared to be a magnificent achievement, heading off Walter Martin from putting us in his next book on the cults, taking us out of that, making us a mainstream Christian church. But it seemed to Andreasen that the Questions on Doctrine authors, plus the General Conference president at that time, were not interested in hearing his concerns. And then he began to write open letters to the churches. What may not be generally known is that Andreasen agreed that most of Questions on Doctrine was solid Adventist thinking. He was primarily concerned with what he called the troublesome issues, the atonement, and the human nature of Jesus Christ. Now, we must recognize the presuppositions of Barnhouse and Martin as they came to this conference. The human Jesus for them was impeccable. Now that's a heavy-duty theological word. It means incapable of sinning. Jesus Christ. Bavinck, one of their theological giants, wrote that the possibility of Jesus sinning and falling is an atrocious idea, for then God Himself must have been able to sin, which it is blasphemy to think. So you can easily imagine why Adventist authors that they were reading appeared very cultic with that mindset, that understanding. An individual decided after the conferences had all been over to contact Donald Barnhouse directly by telephone. And he asked some questions. Here was one of his questions. They, the Adventist leaders, are taking the position, are they not, that Christ has the nature of Adam before he sinned. Isn't that true? Barnhouse replied, "I hope not. Adam was created a being subject to fall. Jesus Christ was the God-man not subject to fall." So his position, again, way beyond what we wanted even to say. In another article that Barnhouse wrote later, he said this: "The Adventist leadership proclaims that the writings of Ellen G. White are not on a parity with Scripture." And so in this same telephone conversation, the questioner asked, "Do they feel," meaning the leaders of the Adventist Church, "that she has written error?" Barnhouse's response, "Of course they do. Every one of these men have said this to me, every man. She was just a good woman who was greatly blessed and greatly mistaken frequently." And so the questioner asked, "You don't think Elder Froome and the others believe that she was a true prophet?" Barnhouse's response, "Of course they don't." Now remembering that's his perception. That's his perception of the discussions went on, but it is his perception of what the discussions were. Again, he said this: "Well, let's face it. In a very nice way, the leaders who have written this book, Questions on Doctrine, have moved from the traditional position of the Seventh-day Adventist movement." And he told the questioner, "If you try to write a book that there has been no change in Adventism then we're going to have to go back and say, you are Antichrist. In other words, we'll put you back in the cult category. And then one of the most amazing statements that he made during this little conversation: I hate Saturday as a Sabbath religious day. I hate it because Christ hates it. And a report was given of a presentation that he made down in Peru as he was speaking. He struck the palm of his hand with his fist, made a loud slap, and said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I curse the seventh-day Sabbath." That's the person we were trying so hard to persuade, to be a part of, to ingratiate ourselves with. Very interesting. Now, hovering over this theological fog that Questions on Doctrine generated was the doctrinal imprimatur, meaning official recognition that the book was getting around the Adventist world. Andreasen declared Questions on Doctrine to be a betrayal in order to gain recognition from the evangelicals. And then George Knight observed this remarkably. He said, unfortunately, there does appear to be elements of a betrayal in the manipulation of the data and in the untruths that were passed on to Barnhouse and Martin. The result would spell disaster in the Adventist ranks in the years to come. Official Adventism may have gained recognition as being Christian from the evangelical world, but in the process a breach had been opened which has not healed in the last 50 years and may never heal. That from the one who wanted the book reprinted in the year 2003. Now, what seems to be even a deeper, more serious problem with Questions on Doctrine is what was left unsaid. Barnhouse and Martin were recognized scholars in the Christian world, and what a perfect opportunity this would have been for Adventist scholars to use equally trained minds to share why Adventists do have a distinctive understanding about the gospel and about salvation and the atonement. But like Hezekiah, they failed to show the rich treasures of truth. And we missed the greatest opportunity of the last century to give inquiring minds the parameters of the great controversy as we understand it. The fundamental problem in 1955 to 1957 was that the participants unwittingly tried to merge two different theological systems without realizing all of the ramifications. When Adventists tried to overlay our theology on the evangelical grid, warning lights and buzzers should be going off for us because many areas simply won't fit. Two scholars giving a little historical reflection said, Questions on Doctrine raised uncertainties about what Adventists actually believed that made the evangelical era that followed the most destabilizing in the church's history. A group of prominent leaders in Loma Linda, California signed an unambiguous statement charging that Questions on Doctrine misrepresented certain vital fundamentals and compromised other tenets of our faith, and that certain statements and teachings of the book will never be accepted by a considerable number of our people. In fact, it is our conviction that not since the time of J.H. Kellogg's pantheistic controversy of more than a half century ago has anything arisen to cause such disquietude, dissension, and disunity among our people as the publication of this book. Raymond Cottrell was then an associate editor of the commentary series which was being produced during those years, and he predicted, almost certainly there will also arise a storm of opposition when our ministry and laity discover the real meaning of the actual terms on which we have achieved rapprochement with Martin and other evangelicals. And other North American leaders like R.R. Beats predicted a great disaster ahead, saying that a tornado was yet to come. Theodore Karsich, president of the Central Union Conference, called Questions on Doctrine a clever and subtle attempt to undermine the foundational doctrines of Seventh-day Adventists. And Cottrell was even more prophetic. Let us be certain that nothing gets into the proposed book that will take us the next 50 years to live down. Now, obviously, Seventh-day Adventists should have great difficulty trying to harmonize our beliefs of salvation with our Calvinist friends, no matter how much linguistic gymnastics we might come up with. Let's look back for a moment at those four issues that Walter Martin was concerned about. Number one, the atonement was not completed at the cross. For the evangelical mind, everything, and I mean everything, important to the plan of salvation was completed with the death of Christ. For them, the Old Testament was largely about a failed system of salvation by works. So when Jesus died, He inaugurated a new covenant, a new method of salvation by grace alone. And therefore, nothing really needs to be accomplished after that, except the fulfilling of some of the Old Testament prophecies that weren't completely fulfilled. Now, the Adventist answer that we gave to Walter Martin that satisfied him was that the atonement was completed at the cross, and that Christ has been ministering the benefits of that atonement ever since from the heavenly sanctuary. And my friends, that sounds good, but it is not the Adventist position at all. Adventists have always believed that the covenant of grace began not at the cross, but in Genesis 3:15, with the promise of Christ's defeat of Satan. And everyone who has ever been saved or will ever be saved by that provision of grace. This promise was only ratified and made legal with the death of Christ on the cross. But the plan of atonement, the atonement process, will not be completed fully until sin is not only forgiven but removed come from the lives of Christians and finally from the universe. The sanctuary shows this so clearly. The altar of burnt offering in the outer courtyard was the central aspect of their daily rituals, pointing clearly to the death of Christ, the sacrifice being offered. But that outer courtyard was incomplete until the Day of Atonement cleansed sin from the entire sanctuary. Both were necessary to complete the plan of atonement. Adventists have always believed that the death of Christ was the first step of the atoning process. It is the vital step. But that has to be completed in the final generation with the sealing of the 144,000 and the close of probation, and we have called this the final atonement, or the final part of the atoning process. Without that, it cannot be completed, the cleansing of the sanctuary. And this belief, my friends, as you well know, is totally unique to Seventh-day Adventism. You will not hear it anywhere else, ever in the Christian world. And that would have been totally unacceptable to Martin and the evangelical world. So we hid this emphasis from Barnhouse and Martin so they would accept us as fellow Christians. This progression is even seen in the three casting downs of Satan. First, he was cast out of the courts of heaven. That was just an exile. Then he was cast down to earth at the death of Christ because he lost all credibility with the unfallen world, the angels. But he is only bound, which means totally defeated, at the second coming. Completion. You see, the issue is not about Christ ministering the benefits of His sacrifice in the holy place, but completing His atonement in the most holy place. And my friends, there is major disagreement among Seventh-day Adventists on this very point today. All right, that's the first point. Second point, salvation is grace plus works. Now that's very easy to answer by showing that works never merit or earn our salvation. Salvation is always a gift of grace. But grace always works, meaning obedient acts are always the natural result of transforming grace. But that's still difficult for the evangelical mindset, even to say that. Because for them, obedient acts are not a condition of salvation and are not necessary for salvation, because you can be saved in some disobedience. Point number 3, Jesus was a created being. Once again, easy to answer by showing clear statements from Ellen G. White and our scholars that Jesus was fully God, existing from all eternity. But the problem was, as you may know, that our early pioneers did believe that Jesus had a beginning at some point, and he was brought into existence by the Father at some point. And that's where Martin had his confusion. Number 4, Jesus took man's fallen, sinful nature at the incarnation. This was, and still is, the single biggest point of conflict with the evangelical world and within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, there's one aspect of this that's not often discussed, and it's worth just a little bit of study. It's the word grace. I'm going to share 2 statements with you. This is from My Life Today, page 100. We would never have learned the meaning of this word grace had we not fallen. God loves the sinless angels who do His service and are obedient to all His commands, but He does not give them grace. These heavenly beings know not of grace. They have never needed it, for they have never sinned. Grace is an attribute of God shown to undeserving human beings. God rejoices to bestow this grace on everyone who hungers for it. My Life Today, page 100. Now, from God's Amazing Grace, page 129. It was according to the determinate counsel of God that man should be created, endowed with power to do the divine will. God gave Adam and Eve power to obey within their very nature. So the key point of these 2 statements is grace was not needed by the angels or Adam and Eve because they had inherent power in their nature to be obedient. Grace is needed, in fact, is our only hope for fallen men and women because we have no power within our nature to obey. So we need grace. Grace is only necessary and is only given to those who can obey in no other way. So grace is very simply for those with fallen nature, while power is for those with unfallen nature, residing within that nature. Now I'm going to read you snippets of 2 letters that were sent into Ministry Magazine. The first one said, "A sinless spiritual nature that Christ possessed enabled Him to perfectly obey His Father's law, whereas every other human being sinful in nature, lives under the new covenant, being in need of grace to be saved." What that is simply saying is that Christ did not need grace because He had power in His sinless nature to be obedient, like the angels. Then another letter in the same issue. I have one question. Did not Jesus have to depend on grace to resist sin, as do we? If He had within Him the innate power to resist sin, then He would not have conquered Satan on the same ground where we live. And so you have an opposite letter there. And so the question is very simple. Did Christ need or receive grace, or did He not? That's the question. I'm going to read a few more statements to you. This one is Acts of the Apostles, page 56. You decide if Christ needed or received grace. To the consecrated worker, there is wonderful consolation in the knowledge that even Christ, during His life on earth, sought His Father daily for fresh supplies of needed grace. Behold the Son of God. He strengthens His faith by prayer and by communion with heaven, gathers to Himself power to resist evil. All right, let's try another one. Testimonies, Volume 1, 339 and 40. Jesus, considered as a man, was perfect, yet He grew in grace. And then Luke 2:52 is quoted, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And you know what that word favor is in the original language? It's grace. In grace. Christ's Object Lessons 139. Daily He, Christ, received a fresh baptism of the Holy Spirit. In the early hours of the new day, the Lord awakened Him from His slumbers, and His soul and His lips were anointed with grace. With grace. Letter 159 in 1903, he sought for strength to meet the foe, for the assurance that he would receive grace to carry out all that he had undertaken in behalf of humanity. So, my friends, did Christ need and did he receive grace? Now, what does that mean for us? A couple more statements. Review and Herald, April 1, 1902. He has made abundant provision for every soul to have such grace and strength that he will be more than a conqueror in the warfare against sin. He came to this world and lived a sinless life, that in his power, his people might also live lives of sinlessness. He desires them by practicing the principles of truth to show to the world that God's grace has power to sanctify the heart. So grace is desperately needed for victory over sin, and Jesus showed the way. One more. God's amazing grace, page 230. He expects nothing of his disciples that he is not willing to give them grace and strength to perform. He would not call upon them to be perfect if he had not at his command every perfection of grace to bestow on the ones upon whom he would confer so high and holy a privilege. Jesus revealed no qualities and exercised no powers that men may not have through faith in him. Well, my friends, grace is our only hope of obeying. Amen. We will never, never on this earth move beyond the need of grace. Even when we don't need forgiving grace any longer, we will need overcoming grace every step of the way. Because we have no power in our fallen nature, and we will never have power in our fallen nature to obey even after the close of human probation. It will be God's gift of grace then more than ever that is needed. And then we just read that Jesus exercised no powers that fallen man may not have, which means he couldn't have had the power of the angels or of Adam before the fall, because we can't have that. So the evidence, my friends, is not substantial, it is conclusive, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Jesus needed and received grace during his entire life on earth, not for forgiveness, but for overcoming and victory, constantly. Since the only ones who need grace, we're told very clearly, are fallen human beings, is it not crystal clear that it was Jesus' fallen, sinful nature that needed daily supplies of overcoming grace? Just that one word, grace, should settle the question in our Seventh-day Adventist Church. Well, a little more detail as the progression continues. A new book replaced Questions on Doctrine as the authoritative book of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, defining our various positions. And the one who was assigned the job of writing that particular restatement of our it's, you know it as Seventh-day Adventists believe, we're still using it today, was Norman Gully. And here are a couple of statements from him. Christ took the spiritual nature of man before the fall and the physical nature of man after the fall. So a divided nature. Something from Adam before the fall and something after the fall, only physical. And then he tacks on original sin as our lot in life. We do not have to do anything wrong to become sinners. We are born that way. And then you add one more point about the judgment. The pre-Advent judgment primarily concerns itself with our acceptance of Christ's substitutionary life and death rather than mainly with our life. Now, one aspect of Questions on Doctrine that, to my knowledge, has never been discussed before this particular conference in 2007 is the attempt that was made to bring original sin into the theology of Adventism in the 1950s. Original sin simply is the teaching that we are lost and condemned because we inherit fallen nature and are children of fallen Adam. We are born in a state of sin and condemnation. That's original sin. And I'm indebted to Larry Kirkpatrick for unearthing the pre-publication draft of Questions on Doctrine before it was published. Listen to the pre-publication draft. Adam's sin involved the whole human race. By one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, declares the Apostle Paul. The expression by sin shows clearly that he is referring not to actual individual sins, but rather to original sin, the sinful nature that we have all inherited from Adam. By that original sin, death passed upon all men. That was in the original draft that they hoped to be published in Questions on Doctrine. The pre-publication draft shows clearly that the authors of Question on Doctrine equated sinful nature with original sin. And in one of the very few responses to that pre-publication draft that came in was one by Raymond Cottrell. Listen to what he said. "This is the first I knew that Adventists believe in original sin. This term would require sacramental practices such as infant baptism." Well, the section was modified. They didn't make it quite as strong in the publishing of the actual book. But you know, even an editor cannot turn one system into its opposite. The essence of the Questions on Doctrine's viewpoint still was in there and is found in the book 2 paragraphs later in the printed book. Here's what it says. "From Adam we have all inherited a sinful nature. We are all by nature the children of wrath. Consequently, all are guilty before God." It was still there, just not quite as blatant, not quite as overt. So it's evident that the authors of Questions on Doctrine viewed man as guilty or condemned on the basis of his inherited birth nature. Adam's sin, according to the authors of Questions on Doctrine, brought not only death but condemnation to the entire race, a condemnation existing apart from any willful personal decision to be a rebel. Remember, the question according to Adventism has always been, what is the nature of sin for which man is considered guilty, so guilty that he must die in the fires of hell unless he is rescued by the grace of God? The 1957 teaching, my friends, had never been Adventist teaching and doctrine. The sin for which we are considered guilty always before had been viewed by Adventists as an issue of free will, free choice, exercised in rebellion. Nevertheless, the new doctrine of sin was now being portrayed to the evangelicals as that adhered to by Seventh-day Adventists and has become mainstream today in Adventist thinking and scholarship. If sin is built into one's very nature, as taught in Questions on Doctrine, then there is no means for its eradication but to wait for God to change that nature at the moment of glorification, if it's hardwired into us. And now it's very common to hear Adventists say that we will be sinning until Jesus comes. Furthermore, the 1957 introduction of the doctrine of original sin also makes it necessary to protect the humanity of Jesus from having the same nature as all other men. If we are guilty for our birth natures, then Jesus can't have that same birth nature. So the doctrine of original sin destroys the brotherhood between Jesus and fallen man. He is substantially different. And so we see the imperative reason why the engineers of Questions on Doctrine felt it so needful to bend Seventh-day Adventist teaching concerning the humanity of Christ. And now we begin to see the reason for the major attempt in Questions on Doctrine and the ministry articles to change our position on the nature of Christ. Because some leaders had already accepted the Augustinian Calvinist doctrine of original sin. Thus our positions on the nature of Christ and the possibility of sinlessness in the last generation because of the final atonement had to be radically revised. And my friends, the battle over these issues has not gone away or lessened in the past 50 years. And this is why the Questions on Doctrine conference was held in 2007 in spite of the General Conference President's opposition. A little anecdote. A seminary student during those years was doing janitorial work. I was cleaning Elder Froome's office when I noticed a letter resting open and neatly placed squarely in the center of what was always an otherwise barren desktop. But it seemed that I should stop just then and read that one sheet of paper. A girl had fairly recently accepted the Adventist message and had been baptized. Her father and mother, upon learning of this, were deeply upset. In reaction, they wrote to a well-known defender of evangelical Protestantism, Dr. Donald Gray Barnhouse. They told him of the terrible thing that was happening to their daughter and then pled with him for help. She's joining a cult. Dr. Barnhouse wrote them a letter in reply. He then told the girl's parents that he and Dr. Martin were working to bring Seventh-day Adventists into harmony with evangelical Protestantism by actually changing their doctrines. And he encouraged the couple with the assurance that he and Mr. Martin were succeeding. Here are just a couple of results of the doctrinal conflicts we've had in the church over the past 50 years. A survey was taken in 1989 of pastors in the Southeastern California Conference, where I began my ministry. 66% of the pastors did not affirm our traditional position on Daniel 8:14. It's a large percentage, 66%. Here's a statement that was on this survey. A loyal Adventist has no reason to doubt the accuracy of Ellen White's statements. 36% agreed with that statement. Another statement on the survey. A person should accept the prophetic role of Ellen White before being baptized as a Seventh-day Adventist. 31% of the pastors agreed with that statement. Most ministers simply didn't believe that a person should have to accept Mrs. White's prophetic role before becoming a Seventh-day Adventist. So traditional Adventism was not very popular among those ministers that were surveyed. The majority of the answers of that survey would comport with what is known today as evangelical Adventism, at least 60%. In the January-February 1994 issue of Adventist Today appeared the article Evangelical Adventism. In 1957, with the publication of Questions on Doctrine, denominational leaders clarified which theological stream represented official Seventh-day Adventism. Among the theological positions taken in Questions on Doctrine are the following. Jesus Christ is sinless in his human nature. The substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ for the salvation of sinners was finished at the cross. Evangelical Adventists consider the positions taken in Questions on Doctrine to be an expression of both authentic and evangelical Adventism. And you know that name, Evangelical Adventism, probably first appeared with reference to Seventh-day Adventism with the first issue of a magazine called Evangelica, a publication for evangelical Adventists in October of 1980. The movement was articulated by Ellen Crandall, the editor. In the May 1982 edition of Evangelical, Crandall stated that the roots of evangelical Adventism extended back to Questions on Doctrine and that it had been watered during the 1960s and 1970s by gospel preachers. Well, there's a thumbnail sketch of what happened during those years and what was at stake and why we are still dealing with it today. It is the heart and soul of Seventh-day Adventist understanding of who we are, what our mission is, what has to happen before Jesus can come, and will it happen at all? I'm going to finish up. I already quoted a little bit from Larry Kirkpatrick, who dug up this pre-publication draft. And I thought he said something really special that I want to kind of finish up with. We'll conclude with the real question, which is, should Seventh-day Adventists try to be identified with evangelical Christians? That's the question. That was the question in the 1950s. It is the question of today. Should we try to be identified with evangelicals? Here's what he says. What value would there be for Adventists being identified as evangelicals? The label comes with a troubling set of negatives. a teaching of forever burning hell, a teaching of the natural immortality of the soul, and the idea of an American empire, and the initiation of wars such as the invasion of Iraq. That war, whatever you think of it, is seen as an evangelically supported war. The closer that we are identified with evangelicals, the more we would be identified with their politics. When evangelicals mix church and state, and we seek to identify ourselves as being evangelical, we lose our high ground of apolitical neutrality. A small sampling of books currently available on Amazon: The Scandal of the Evangelical Conscience, The Great Evangelical Disaster, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, The Tragedy of Compromise, The New Evangelicalism, just a few samples of currently available books. So being an evangelical today is not exactly felt to put one in the best company in some quarters. Some Adventists question the value of being closely identified with evangelicalism. And you know what? Not just Adventists. One of the participants in the 2007 conference was a non-Seventh-day Adventist scholar. Listen to what he said to us. I would then call Adventism to explore its own sources for insights. This is certainly a higher calling than the efforts to assimilate to the evangelical tradition that seems to dominate such discussions as the questions on doctrine. I fear that Adventism may sell its heritage for a mess of pottage. Amazing perception from outside our blinders, in which we see things very narrowly. Again from Larry Kirkpatrick. Questions on Doctrine was a mistake because it erected a new Adventism when the current one had already been supplied by God. Questions on Doctrine was a mistake because it did not tell the truth about what Seventh-day Adventists believed. By the mid-1950s, but few in-the-pew Adventists believed as Questions on Doctrine claimed. Martin and Barnhouse knew that Questions on Doctrine did not square with the Adventism that had gone before it. The power of Adventism is found in its two T's, in termination and transformation. The Seventh-day Adventist message is all about termination, the end of sin and sinning, the end of suffering and evil. Our message is also about the other T, transformation. This too is an attack on sin. The status quo is unacceptable. Strengthened by the helping grace of Christ, we are changed here and now. The universe sees that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Transformation and termination are the strengths of pre-Questions on Doctrine Adventism. But Questions on Doctrine undermined the very things it was claimed to help. Be all that as it may, the future of Seventh-day Adventist mission and message is bright. A vigorous, fresh wave of young people are thriving in the grassroots. Many of these energetic Adventists are motivated by an understanding very similar to that which illumined the writings of M.L. Andreasen. It is very much pre-QOD Adventism. An army of young people with faith in God and a trust in the Scriptures are evangelistically primed. What's more, they uphold the full inspiration and authority of the Ellen G. White writings. They are learning, they are growing, they are formidable. One day soon, God will say, "Here are they that keep the commandments of God." In the end, God wins. And the third angel's message turns out to be true. Victory over sin was just what the Bible said it was. The mission heaven assigned to this community of faith was right after all. God will triumph, and His faithful ones will triumph with Him. And so where do we go from here? The church is terribly divided on these points. The sides are so far apart. We are divided by very basic positions concerning the authority of inspired writings. We are in an almost agreed separation. And yet all of this could have been so different. Andreasen was right 50 years ago when he wrote, "Some of our brethren, in order to be considered orthodox, have compromised our position. I challenge their right to commit the denomination, and I protest." And that spirit of protest has never ended to this day. Pre-QOD Adventism today is bright with energy. Unquote. My friends, God has a message and a movement, and Satan is doing everything he can to derail it. He plants seeds very carefully and thoroughly. He makes sure they are watered and they grow to fruition, and everything we have been seeing in the course of the last 30 years has been nurtured from those seeds. All the problems that we see around us and all the controversies had their seed-bearing properties back then. Desmond Ford, he was just one of the fruits on the tree. He was not an innovator. He was a producer of what had already been planted. And so, my friends, we've got to understand a bit of our history if we're going to understand our future and get it right. May God help us to be true Seventh-day Adventists, believing in a final atonement process, believing in a Christ who had victory over sin through the grace of Jesus, of His Father, constantly supplied to Him, and that we can have that same experience. The gospel is living, it's alive, and it will be victorious. I am confident, and I want you to be just as confident.